So good morning, everybody. Great to see you all. This is our very first Manly Talks via Zoom. So I'm Candy Bingham, President of Good for Manly Association and Deputy Mayor. And I also have online with us, I'm delighted to say, John Brogden, AM. Good morning, John.
Morning, Candy and everybody.
Yeah, great to see you. So how we're going to run this morning is, first of all, we have a very good video that John's provided for us that he made last year, I think, which really does tell his story, which is excellent. And then we'll invite John to speak to us, probably for about 25 minutes or so. And then we'll have questions and answers. And a number of you, thank you, have already sent questions. If you haven't and you want to ask a question, if you just get your cursor and take it down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A section there. And just type in your question there and I'll relay it to John. Unfortunately, we can't hear you or see you, but I can see that you're online. So that's wonderful. All right. So many of you will remember John as the local member for Pittwater some years ago. He was also the New South Wales Liberal leader. And today he's the CEO of Landcom and also the chair of Lifeline. And as well as that, John and his wife Lucy are very busy as advocates for mental health. In fact, Lucy is the chair of the National Mental Health Commission. So thank you both for the amazing amount of work that you do.
Oh, thank you.
All right, John, shall we run the video? Let's see what happens. Okay.
My plan was always that if things went bad, I would kill myself. I always had that from a young age. I remember it very vividly. I used to think I was like a record on a turntable, spinning faster and faster and faster and edging towards the end where I'd spin off. We had a very difficult time as kids. My parents, they were very unhappy for as long as I can remember, and they used to fight a lot. We were never hit, but, you know, we were verbally hit most days of the week. So that was very, very difficult to cope with. All of that I just tied up in a really tight ball and buried very deep inside myself. I became a Member of Parliament. I ran for pre-selection at 21, 24, 27, got elected to Parliament. I was widely discussed as the next leader of the Liberal Party. And I was inconsolably miserable. I'd spent all that anger and there was nothing there but an empty hole. I'd been sort of getting more manic as opposition leader, and I found myself at an event where I said and did some things that were pretty stupid and inappropriate. And I went from seeing the path to victory to complete catastrophe. We only had one child at that time, but Lucy had just fallen pregnant. So I thought, you know, I'm a burden on Lucy and our children. Because I felt I was a burden on other people, the last thing I could do was talk to them about what I'd done, because that would deepen the burden. Not only did I think it was the right thing to do, to take my own life, I thought it was the best thing to do. I remember so clearly going from this is a disaster to this is the end. The hardest part by far was about 2 days after I'd gone into the clinic after my suicide attempt. They sent a psychiatrist to see me. I said, what do I do now? Everything I wanted has collapsed. He said, John, things will get better. I remember looking at him saying, how can you possibly say that? Things will never get better. But he's right. Things can get better. There is a way through. There is a way through, and there are people who love you and there are people who care, and you're not the burden you think you are. We received letters and emails, and I remember one, and it was a letter from a guy who said, Dear Mr. Ogden, we all make mistakes, that's why pencils have rubbers on the other end. And that one line, as I was getting better, said, we can all fix these burdens, we can work our way through these things. And you don't ask for depression or bipolar. You don't ask to be suicidal. It comes. So you shouldn't feel guilty about something over which you have no control. The world wasn't better off without me. I know that now, and I thank God every day that I didn't complete my suicide. And if I had to talk to somebody right now who was in that situation, I'd hold their hand, I'd bring them close, and I'd tell them that there is more to live for than there is to die for.
For more real stories like John's and to find support, visit betteroffwithyou.org.au.
Yes, a very moving video. Thank you, John. And I really do think that it sets the scene. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure now to hand over to John Brogden to talk about mental illness, the conversation that we need to have. Thanks, John.
Look, thank you, Candy, and thanks for bringing this group together on such an important issue, made all the more important in the middle of this extraordinary time in which we live. To give some context to that video, it was myself and two others. I think, Candy, you were there for the launch. Myself and two other people who happen to live on the Northern Beaches, talking about the issue of burdensomeness. And that is the feeling that you are a burden when you have a mental illness, and when you are feeling suicidal, you're a burden on other people. And it is a very shared experience by people who go to take their own lives, that you're a burden, and that, as I said before, not just the only thing to do, but the best thing to do is to take your own life. Look, I'm a 51-year-old man. I have depression, and I have suicidal ideation. The depression is something we've all heard of before in terms of our own experiences or that of others. For me, I'm medicated for my depression. I take two medications. One's a mood stabiliser and one's an antidepressant. I take those every day of my life. I'll probably take them for the rest of my life. In terms of counselling, I see a psychiatrist every fortnight. In terms of coping with my depression, I often think the way I describe this is the way somebody might describe a physical illness, say diabetes or the like, in that I try and get exercise, I try and eat well, I try and get, today's not a great day for this, but a bit of sun on my face at least half an hour a day. These things are all very important. And for me, particularly as I've got older, sleep has become very important for me in terms of managing my depression. Probably the biggest thing I do in managing my depression is avoid situations that I know will get me depressed, or I know that will get me stressed. That took a long time to learn to do, because as Australians, or I don't know if it's Australian, but in the culture that I grew up in, we're taught to do things. You know, you turn up and you're nice to people, and that can include family people who from time to time will make you stressed or depressed. So I've just decided there is a whole number of situations in my life, and frankly, a whole number of people in my life I don't do well to see, and they don't do me any good. So I've made the decision to effectively cut those stressful and depressive parts of my life out. In terms of suicidal ideation, it is effectively, suicide is always in my mind. It's always an option for me. And the times when it becomes dangerous for me is when things go very wrong, usually very quickly, and I can catastrophize things very quickly. And from that point, it's not a very long walk from there to thinking about suicide. So I have slowly learned, and I'm no expert, I'm here to tell you, I've slowly learned how to better deal with stressful situations, how to, in my own mind, manage them so they don't become catastrophes. Or if they do become catastrophes, how to settle down and realise that there is a way through. One of the important messages I bring is that there is a way through a suicide attempt. And my friend Barry O'Farrell used to talk about the fact we've had a renaissance in the area of mental health in the last 20 years in Australia. And I'd take a punt, Candy, that 20 years ago we wouldn't be talking about this in any community group in the way we talk about it now. Certainly in businesses we wouldn't talk about this. Nobody would put their hand up in a business environment to say they have a mental illness. They'd think that that'd be the end of their career, end of their job. We have had a massive awakening to what mental health is, that it is something that affects a very large percentage of society, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, depending on what set of numbers you look at. And it is like a physical health issue, in the sense that you could have a depressive episode that's around the loss of a loved one, the loss of your business, something that, the failure of a relationship. And that could come and go over a period of time, just as you might have a skin cancer that, you gets cut off, you look after yourself, doesn't come back. So there are lots of physical analogies that I like to bring when I talk about mental loss, because my great post-political public objective is that we think about and we talk about and we feel about mental health in the same way we think about and we talk about and we feel about physical health. And in doing so, we take away the stigma. And it's important to hear people talk about it, but we don't hear a lot of people talk about the other side of a suicide attempt. And I understand that. It's a very difficult issue. There's probably no one on this webinar today who hasn't been affected directly or indirectly by suicide. There's very few things that are sadder. A funeral of somebody who's taken their own life is inconsolably sad. Many of us will say, gee, I didn't know he or she was that bad. If only I knew, I would have done more. So we go away, not self-indulgently guilty, but genuinely guilty that we've played a role in somebody taking their own life. Some of them make sense, most of them don't. Most of them, why? If only he or she had stopped and thought there was a way through, we could have helped them get a way through. The suicide numbers in Australia are very stubborn. So about 3,200 Australians took their life in the last census. One of the things, and this is an important area for local government, Candy, and for our local police and ambulance and hospitals, is we have very poor data on suicide. It usually lags terribly, partly because there are a lot of coronial inquiries that go on. But in a place like the Northern Beaches, which isn't so far from a country town in the sense that people do know people very well, they do know what's going on. As I used to say when I was the member for Pittwater in particular, my constituents haven't crossed the bridge for 2 years, and I was referring to the Narrabeen Bridge, not the Harbour Bridge, let alone the Spit Bridge. But it is a close community. But you could have somebody down the road whose child or parent takes their own life, and you mightn't have any idea because of the modern busy lifestyles we live in which we live, should I say. And in a country town, you'll almost hear about it. So we had a suicide and a suicide attempt up off Bilgola Headland. Lucy and I and the family live in Bilgola. 1 week to the 14-year-old boy who was sadly completed his suicide. The very next week, 12-year-old girl, same place, same time. Thankfully, she did not complete her suicide. But we need to know more locally through the data that the anecdotes and the data that police have, that surf clubs have, that schools have, that parents have, that on and on the list goes, because then we can quickly find out if there's a cluster going on and if a certain space or a certain place has been all of a sudden become a hotspot, as we call them, for suicides. The other difficulty with youth suicides is that, and I know this is so tragic, is that often a kid who's very lonely, and I think in our world you can be lonely in plain sight. People say, oh, we're all connected through social media. I just think that's rubbish. I think you can be very, very lonely in plain sight, and you can be very, very bullied on things like social media. I don't think social media has yet proved any benefits to mental health. It may do, but not yet. But if you go to the funeral of a kid at your school who died, and you're sitting there and you're a bit of a loner and you're picked on and all that sort of stuff, and you're very susceptible to the negativities of life, and you're watching this kid at your school being praised and eulogised to the stars at a funeral, in many cases that is a stimulus for some kids to take their own life, because they sit there and think, well, he or she is loved and eulogised and said to be very important. Here I am with no friends and no life. Well, maybe that's the way I can become eulogised and loved by others. So, look, this is a very complex issue, suicide. 50% of people who take their own lives have never, ever had any contact with the mental health system. So this area is a little disputed. Not all people who take their own lives are mentally ill. You could live 100 years, everything could go right for the first 50, and then bad on one day. And if you get through that day, you might live another 50 years without a thought of suicide.
Mm.
The other complexity with it is when I first came into this space myself, through my own experience, I used to think that suicide was a bit like cancer in this sense, that the worse your cancer gets, the more likely you are to die. And the worse your depression or your bipolar gets, the more likely you are to die by suicide. Not true. You can be lifelong, really heavy depressive, very poor, very bad depression for your entire life and never have a single suicidal thought. So it's not linear in the way that many physical illnesses are. There are signs to people's behaviour. We had an incredible story, Candy, at our Central West Lifeline, Dubbo, Orange, etc., of a bloke who turned up to the pub, a farmer turned up to the pub where he usually has a beer, turned up a bit better dressed than usual, not in his work gear. He had a collared shirt on and had cleaned up and had a shave. It didn't come from work, if I can paint this picture in your mind. He went around and said, had a chat to most of the people and then paid his tab. And this was a guy who usually had to be asked to pay his tab. He offered to pay his tab. And he was really very friendly to people and thanking them for being such a good friend to him. And somebody at the pub clicked that this was incredibly out of character. And they followed him home and he was trying to kill himself when they caught up with him. So he had literally made the decision that the best solution in his difficult life at that time, drought, all that sort of thing, was to take his own life. And as part of that, he was saying goodbye, literally paying up the tab and then going home with the plan. So you can note people's behaviours from time to time. With depression and other mental illnesses, people will often say, look, I'm not an expert. What do I do? And what are the signs? And often there's significant changes in people's behaviour, whether it's at work or at the surf club. And I use that as a great Northern Beaches analogy, the surf club or in your family or from work. Mm-hmm. So what you will find is people having significant and continued changes in their behaviour. Somebody who never drinking a lot. Somebody who always took pride in their presence, turning up to work like a hobo or the surf club like a hobo. Somebody who was usually quite friendly, very reserved. And in and of yourself and watching it of other people, other extremes, can't sleep or can't get out of bed, won't eat or can't stop eating. So it's these extremes in people's behaviour. And it's not a bad day. We all have bad days and a couple of bad days in a row. This is a sustained change in behaviour. And often people will keep it private. One of the things, and the magnificent team at Lifeline Northern Beaches run this course, and if anybody's interested, I'd suggest it's a great course for everybody in the community, not just for you personally, but for the club you're in or for the organisation you're associated or friends and family. It's called the Accidental Counsellor. And what it means is from time to time, we find ourselves becoming an accidental counsellor. We're sitting next to a friend and we say, how's it all going? And they say, not well, rather than the good old fashioned Australian, oh, good, fine, let's move on. I've ticked that box. It's almost just a social trigger. We're not really asking how you are, and this is the Are You OK concept as well. At Lifeline, beyond Lifeline, what the mental health sector has found, both through the science and through the anecdotal behaviour, is if you're worried about somebody, rather than let's go and have a beer, let's go out for dinner, let's go and see a movie, let's go for a surf or whatever, you've got to confront the issue. Now, every bone in my body tells me that probably one of the hardest conversations I could ever have with a friend or an acquaintance or a family member is this one. Are you feeling suicidal? Do you think you're going to hurt yourself or kill yourself? Every bone in my body says I could never say that. And wouldn't I be putting that thought in that person's mind? The reality is what you're doing, a bit like those old Western movies where, they suck the snake bite poison out of somebody's leg. You're bringing it out of them. And you actually do bring it out of people. And some people will say, look, actually I am, I'm really, there's nothing to live for, or, marriage broken down, relationship broken down, business gone broke. And right now in COVID, we're hearing this everywhere. We're hearing, there are people running out of hope very quickly, and particularly post JobKeeper. That's not a political comment. But from our perspective, JobKeeper has been a lifesaver because it's basically said to people, you'll be all right for the next few months. But things like Qantas getting rid of 6,000 staff will scare a lot of people rigid thinking, wow, that's a third of their workplace. I work at a bank, and or I work here, I work there. We won't flip the switch and go back into normal business when this thing finishes and when JobKeeper finishes. So, what happens next? Now, what we find is when you bring that out of people, that's the best way to do it. Now, most will say, no, look, I'm not real well because this happened or that happened. And people often say to me, well, what do I do then, John? What do I do then? And I always say, you would never walk past somebody having a heart attack. If somebody in your meeting or somebody in your world had a heart attack, if you knew CPR, you'd administer it. If you didn't, even if you didn't, you'd just ring 000 and you'd stay with that person until the ambulance came, or you'd throw them in your car and get them to hospital. Whatever, you wouldn't walk past a person who's having a heart attack. So why would you walk past somebody who is having a mental health episode or suicidal? So I say to people, if you find yourself in that situation, hang on to them. Physically hang on to them. Get them to an ambulance, get them to an emergency department, get them with 000, whatever you need to do. Don't walk away from that person. And you don't have to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist to get them the help they need. You need to pass them on to that. So we can all play a role in saving people's lives. We really can. And when 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of us will have a mental illness at some stage in our life, when 3,200 Australians will take their life, most likely this year. We haven't seen an increase in suicides, I'm pleased to say, through COVID, but we're all very worried about what happens when things begin to become, the reality becomes more and more obvious to us and harsh to many of us. 6 of those 8 people who will take their own life today will likely be men on average. More women attempt to take their own life. More men take their own life more women attempt to take their own life. Fewer men attempt, but they use more sure methods, if I can leave you with that idea, in taking their own life. As my wife Lucy says, that's one area of gender equity we're not looking for. And that's very sad, incredibly sad. There are 2 trends going on. We're seeing increasingly older people take their life. The largest group, the demographic with the largest growth in suicides in Australia are men over 60. Now, most of us would instantly think it's young children. At the other end, believe it or not, the trend we're seeing in the Western advanced world, and this is just heartbreaking, is suicides getting younger, kids under 10 taking their own life. Now, how does that, we sit here and say, how does that happen? How is it possible kids under 10 take their own life? So we're seeing it stretch at both ends. And we're seeing it stubbornly flat at about 3,000, I think 3,127 is the exact figure in Australia. Now, we all need to remember how over the last 30 years, 40 years really, how much effort we've put in to reducing road deaths, RBT, speed cameras, this camera, that camera, on and on the list goes. And what's happened? We've reduced road deaths in Australia at the same time as people on the road have increased, as population's increased. And you know what that number is? That number is half the number of people who take their own life. So I'm telling you, if 8 people died with car accidents every day, it'd be on the news every day. You get this, Candy, with your background, be on the news every day. We'd be protesting about it. We'd be screaming for solutions to be made. We want traffic cameras on every street. We want police on every corner. Yet double that number take their own life every day, double that number over a year. And I know we don't ignore it. I know we don't, we are getting better at dealing with it, but we just need to do a whole lot more. And one of the attractions to accepting Candy's invitation today is we can do more. I mean, I live at the Pittwater end of the Northern Beaches. Most of you folks are at the Manly end. We actually can do community things locally to make a difference. They will be maybe unique to us. We do have great delivery channels, if I can use that phrase, in the Northern Beaches. I mean, when I was in Parliament, if I wanted to get seen quickly, I'd go to schools and surf clubs because, that caught an enormous number of people in my community. So we do have, and I'm not saying this as a proud Northern Beaches person, but we have lots of people who join stuff on the Northern Beaches. So you can reach them through school. You can reach them through soccer, netball, surfing groups, not just surf clubs, but the surfers as well, bushwalkers, bike riders, on and on the list goes. So we don't have the Manly Daily the way we used to, which is sad, because that was an incredibly well-read local newspaper. We don't have that, but we do have social media opportunities. And I think one of the things we have in a community that is, it's not called the Insular Peninsula for nothing, but we can bring people together across that community. We're identified by the Northern Beaches. So I think there's an opportunity for us to do more in a local community in keeping an eye out for people. And this accidental counsellor course I referred to that we run at Lifeline Northern Beaches, we run it around the country, is a very good way. I mean, I think every club should do it. They should do it, for 2 hours after their AGM, because I remember still as the patron of Avalon Surf Club going to the AGM after one of their teenage members took his own life, and nobody had got over that. You never get over that. You try, but a parent who loses a child by suicide, and I've got cousins who've taken their own life. I've been there myself. You never recover fully. The pain of that, the guilt of that, the trauma of that does stay with you. So it's worth making the effort to see what we can do as a local community to bring us together on the ground and bring all those community groups, bring the police together, because tragically the police are usually the first people on site, followed by the ambulances. Lifeline, I've been the chair of Lifeline for 8 years, and Lifeline Australia. Today we'll take somewhere between 2,800 and maybe 3,000 calls. That went up with the bushfires, it went up again with COVID. It's flattened out about now. It's flattened out when the risk of dying from COVID dropped. So that, remember the first month, literally, we thought lots of people would die. We're being told there'll be tens of thousands of deaths. The calls spiked, they've dropped now. We're still getting people who are traumatised and living in bushfire-affected areas who will be traumatised for 2 years, at least. And then there's what we think will be a wave of people who'll be quite stressed and distressed and potentially suicidal following things like JobKeeper coming off again. 10 or 20 times a day, our volunteers around the country and our paid staff on the phone will make an assessment that the other person on the phone is at such a high risk of suicide that we will keep talking to them, and we have a capacity to keep talking to them while we send the police and ambulance to where they are to intervene. We have an interventionist method in Lifeline. Some systems around the world, believe it or not, don't have that. So we're on a life-saving journey every day, Candy. I sometimes say that I'd like to be the chairman of an organisation we can shut down, but it doesn't seem like we'll be able to shut down anytime soon as our calls increase. Through COVID, we've had, in our 57-year history, we've had more calls than we've ever had. The only flip side that's been beneficial is our volunteers have had more time because they were in lockdown, so we've answered more calls. So our call answer rate's the highest it's ever been in living memory. So we've been working hard, but we think there's worse to come. And I'm not saying, I'm an optimist, so please don't think I'm trying to beat this up. I'm usually a great optimist, but we're very worried about when life goes back, JobKeeper lifts and the like, that people will find themselves in a high level of stress and pressure. So I know a lot of you support Lifeline locally, for which I'm incredibly grateful. We do great work on the Northern Beaches. We do great work all over Australia, and we save lives every day. The challenge for us is, the benefit for us is we're anonymous. So it's a pretty interesting concept that you'll ring up somebody you've never met before and you'll never ever meet and pour your heart out to them in a way you don't feel you can pour your heart out to your partner, best mate, list goes on. So the anonymity is a real plus for Lifeline, because and the other thing is we're non-judgmental. We don't care what you've done and who you've done it to. We just want to get you through this point in your life. I always struggle with the analogy as to whether we're the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff or the top of the cliff. But we're an ambulance service. We get you, we keep you alive, and we pass you on to the experts who will keep you going. We do safety plans with people every day, which is about how they will continue to be safe, and whatever interaction works for them. But we've come a long way in Australia, come an enormous way. I must say, the two countries in the world where I'd want to be mentally ill are Australia and New Zealand. We've come an enormous way. It's talked about mostly very responsibly and mostly very professionally these days in the media and in other places. But the numbers aren't moving. They're just not moving. And Lifeline has an ambition of an Australia free of suicide. Many of you will go, well, that'll never happen. Well, until we try, we'll never know. And for those of you who are Rotarians, you'll remember that Rotary had a vision of a world free of, not tuberculosis, was it TB?
Polio.
Polio, thank you very
Yes.
much. Polio, which sadly we've seen a re-emergence of it, but in terms of when 50, 60, 70 years ago, it was rampant and it's disappeared, all but disappeared in countries like Australia and many countries around the world. So Rotary's shown it can be done. So we're very ambitious. Scott Morrison wants towards zero suicide. Gladys wants a 25% reduction in this 4-year term of government. Scotland reduced their suicide rate by 20% in a 10-year period. So if you really focus everything, and it's not about government, it's not only about government money. As I said, if we had a connectedness in our community, more information locally, where there might be, there's one kid at XYZ high school who's suicided, well, how do we make sure that school is wrapped up and looked after? And that kid also is in this soccer club and that surf club and that netball club, and on we go. So we can do our bit locally. We really can to make a difference. We can all make a difference individually by looking after our friends and going that extra mile. Not once a year with Are You OK Day, but every day of the year. So, Candy, thanks for the opportunity to give you some thoughts and share a bit about me and share a bit about the great work of Lifeline. I'm really very happy to take any questions.
John, thank you. And I'm getting quite a few questions actually. But the comments that are coming through is, first of all, a big thank you for being so honest. And I think people have really appreciated how honest you've been, and also helpful and certainly always engaging. A couple of things you got us to think about. First of all, I did like your analogy about think, talk and feel about mental health. I think that's a really good thing that we all need to start doing. I'm actually on the Northern Beaches Community Safety Committee, and I don't know whether you're aware the council does run this. And you're right, the data about suicide is very, very poor, poor. And but I do know that our former area commander did a lot of work on that, absolutely amazing. And our new area commander of police is following the same trail. So that's brilliant.
And Candy, council was fantastic. When we had that second suicide attempt up at Bilgola Headland, I rang Ray Brownlee, who I knew a little bit, and said, Ray, can you just get the council blokes on the truck up there? And I don't care what you put up, just make it harder for people to get to do that. And just as an aside, one of the number one way to prevent suicide is to remove the means of suicide. Mm-hmm. So that's why we have, beautiful Northbridge has an ugly, bloody great fence, fences up on the side, rails up on the side. It's why we do that on roads. It's why the new trains that are being built in Sydney have those doors where you can't get off the platform. So the doors open first before the train opens. So it's very hard to take your own life. Much harder than an old-fashioned railway station. So that's another way council in its safety committee can look and say, well, that's actually that's an area where people could take their own life. What we find is if you're, and many of you remember that wonderful story of that older gentleman who passed away a couple of years ago over at the Gap, who would Bruce was, I think, his name, who would sit there watching people off to take their own life and go and grab them and bring them back and have a cup of tea and save their lives. So if you can intervene at that exact moment, you can make a difference.
Well, look, that's I think one of the questions that we all really want to ask you, and I personally I want to ask this, but also a number of people have asked this as well. I think we all know somebody who clearly is having mental illness issues, but they're in absolute denial. How do you start the conversation? How do you start the conversation with somebody who clearly has mental illness, needs support, but they're in denial?
Yeah. Well, you've asked me the hardest question.
I thought I'd make the hardest one first for you.
Sure. And look, there are three things that have to happen, in my experience, for people to get better, to look after themselves. One is a diagnosis. The second one is acceptance, and the third one is treatment. Now, diagnosis and treatment, and let's face it, we are blessed to live in an area that does have psychiatrists and psychologists. We're not in the back of Burke where you don't have anyone to talk to. We have that capacity. And by and large, we're a wealthy community, so people have the means, by and large. So getting diagnosed and getting the treatment is doable where we live. Hardest thing, Candy, acceptance. So I've got plenty of mates who would, particularly around my age, I had my 50th birthday last year. A third were divorced, a third were married, a third were remarried, including the odd idiot who had a new child at 51. Anyway, a couple of those guys had the most terrible depression around their divorces. would talk to me because they know I'd been through it,
Mm-hmm.
didn't take medication, didn't go and see doctors. And the biggest thing I could do is say, listen, here's my experience and it's worked. So it is really very hard. There's no doubt about that. It is easier if you've had that experience. So if it's a bit like I've been there, if you can say I've been there and it's worked, that helps. There is a real challenge because we know so much about the body. You know, for 30 years, we've been able to operate on a baby's heart in its mother's womb on what we used to call a hole in the heart, congenital heart disease. How remarkable is that? Still to this day, the most effective treatment for people with deep melancholic depression is ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. It's not one flew in the cuckoo's nest. It's, you know, you are properly looked after. Biggest single side effect is a shocking loss of short-term memory, but it will do to somebody with really deep depression what medication could take months to do. And here's the thing, there's not a scientist or a doctor in the world who can tell you why it works. They can tell you that it works. They don't know enough about the brain as to why it works. They're getting closer with ideas. So we know all this about the body, we know so little about the brain. So one of the challenges is you finally get somebody to go to a doctor, they take the medication and it doesn't work for them. So that's their way of saying, I'll never go back again. Some medications make people fat. So you've got to make a decision, I'm happy to be fat and happy rather than miserable and thin. I know that's a gross generalisation, but, you know, a lot of people put on weight with antidepressants, and that's, you know, whoever can make an antidepressant that means you lose weight at the same time will be an instant billionaire. So you've just got to keep going with people like this. You've got to try different angles. You can't give up on them. And I know people in that situation sometimes behave in a fashion where you do give up on them. You're just sick of it. You know, they'll do nothing and then they go and get drunk for 2 days and do stupid things to their friends and family. And then you think, well, I've had it. So it is hard. It's hard to keep loving them through difficult periods of time. I've got friends, you know, in relationships where, you know, one of my wife's best friends, her husband's clearly got depressive issues. Do you think he'll go anywhere near anybody? You know, it will spell the end of their marriage, basically. Now, you know, kids are growing up, so it's not as bad as if it was 10 years ago, but it's still the end of a marriage that might have been improved if he said, yeah, look, I'll go and see a psychologist, psychiatrist.
Could you open the conversation, John, I mean, I don't know, I think this is what we really want to know. How do you open the conversation with somebody that you care about? Do you say, you take it from your own point of view, like, you know, I'm concerned about you and I've noticed changes, or what's the best way to actually start the conversation, do you think?
Yeah, it's a case of, I mean, I know I said it jokingly at the beginning, but, you know, when you say, how are you? Actually, what I've learned to do is, no, how are you? No, how are you? I'm worried about you. Is everything okay? You know, look, you've lost weight, or I think you're drinking too much, which is a real, in my, men my age, is a dead giveaway that things aren't as good as they should be. You know, I don't know anybody who could go through your average divorce and come out the other end without, in some way, being trauma's a heavy word, being distressed. So you look for those signals, but you just keep chipping away. I often, you know, from time to time, I get a call from a friend's dad. He'll say, John, can you go and speak to, you know, long-lasting friend, dad? His dad rings out of the blue, or mum and says, can you speak to so-and-so? I'm really worried about them. So, you know, maybe you might say, well, they're not going to listen to me. Maybe they'll listen to this person or that person. The starting point with a lot of things is people's GPs, and GPs have, over the last 10 years in particular, had a significant increase in their mental health training. So GPs are more open to this than they used to be. And, you know, from a male perspective, where we're indestructible, of course, it's often a case of, listen, I've got a bad knee, and on the way out the door, you know, I'm not so well, I'm a bit depressed. You know? We often see, you know, I know lots of people who see it through the rear vision mirror. I look back a couple of years ago. So we've got to keep making, and this happened, and I was depressed. So we just have to keep talking about it and have to keep making it public. And here's the other thing. People need to see examples, and to some extent I'm one of them. They need to see examples of people who do have mental illness, who can have a fulfilling life. Because many people think, well, that's the enemy. You know, if the guys at work or the girls at work knew that I was depressed, that'd be it. That'd be it. I wouldn't get another promotion. You know, they wouldn't treat me the same. Now, you wouldn't say that about ovarian cancer or prostate cancer or breast cancer. In fact, the reverse, somebody in your friendship circle or at work gets unwell with a well-known cancer. Well, there's an invisible button we push, and the whole joint turns around to support somebody like that. It is beginning to happen. People love to have a go at the public sector for being hopeless, but I will tell you the public sector has led the way in ensuring workplaces are more friendly to people who have mental health concerns. But the short answer is just keep chipping away and keep chipping away from different directions.
Okay. Now I've got the questions are building up, so
I'll try and make my answers shorter then.
Yeah, okay, that's great. So that's tremendous because there's so much interest. So I guess another question, somebody's actually said that they do suffer from depression and that they haven't been brave enough to talk to people about it. So once you tell somebody that you're depressed, is that a good thing? I mean, I think, how do you encourage people who do suffer from depression to have the courage to talk to others about it?
Candy, I always say don't suffer in silence. Please don't suffer in silence. Don't be embarrassed about having depression. I have depression. I didn't ask for it. I didn't do something when I was younger that gave it to me. It's not like skin cancer. Yeah, I spent 30 years, bathing on the beach. Of course, I've got skin cancer. You don't ask for depression. Often it's through a traumatic event in your life over which you had no control when you were in a younger year, whether it's a divorce or violence or whatever it might be. So I think what you'll find, if I can speak directly to that person, is people are much more caring than you think they would be. And if they're not, you've got the wrong group of friends and family. Lifeline's always there. Your GP's always there. There are so many organisations that want to hear from you and help you. But I think we've come a long way. I reckon you're right. 20, 25 years ago, you wouldn't have told anybody. That was the nadir of the what's wrong with you, get off the lounge, what are you whinging about, you've got a great life, what are you talking about? All that those attitudes by and large have gone. And I think the big shift in those attitudes is older Australians who were brought up in that world, don't show any weakness, and back 30 and 40 and 50 years ago, the crazy lady down the road would disappear for 12 months and go on asylum and then come back. Everybody knew there was something wrong. We used to have wonderful phrases for these things. So-and-so's got bad nerves. Remember that? Bad nerves. Or, she's in one of her moods. Well, that was probably depression. So we built a whole language around ignoring this thing and pushing it into the corner. But I do think, I feel a lot better letting people know. And it also helps to understand when I have a bad day. I'll live with this for my whole life. The medication and all the other things help, but I still have bad days. Of course I have bad days. And if people know it of me, just as if you had, I don't know, gout or something like that, where you go for, you've got a bad knee. So maybe you play tennis and then 1 week you can't play. People say, that's because he's got a bad knee. Nobody thinks twice about it. Well, if the answer is, look, he's having a bad week, he's, depression, people will accept it. So I think we're getting better. I think we're getting a lot better. And people are much more understanding, mostly because we talk about it rightly and they know someone in their own life who's had it if they haven't had it themselves.
I think that's right. Now, I've got a couple of questions in relation to youth, and you did talk about the issue that we had in Pittwater earlier. So Eric wants to know what organisations in the local area are doing a great job serving young people who suffer from anxiety and depression. What are they doing that's working, and what help do they need to make an even bigger impact?
Well, one of the other areas we've had an incredible and wonderful improvement is schools. So schools have come a massive distance now in helping kids with mental illness, and particularly, they can't, bullying's bullying's been around since we were all well, for however long, and it will be around. But schools are getting better at dealing with it. This is where social media is not good. This is where social media is terrible. People say on social media things they'd never have the guts to say to somebody face to face. And they don't just say it at school hours, they say it at midnight, 2 a.m, 3 a.m. So social media, please keep an eye on your children or grandchildren's social media behaviour, because they can find themselves in some terrible situations. When our daughter was in year 6 last year, we went to the parent-teacher night and Lucy bravely got up and said, listen, can we have a set of rules? It's not a school issue, but can we have no social media in the chat group from 9 o'clock at night till 7 in the morning? So next day, half the kids turned up and said, "Oh, your mum said this." So, all this crazy social media. Please keep an eye on social media. Schools are great. Schools have come to deal with it quite well. They'll look after kids. They'll begin to realise that kids do have good and bad days. Just as if you had a kid at school with cancer, they'll be in and out of the school a bit. So they've got a lot better. So increasingly, I think, sporting and other groups that have lots of kids, I think they're coming to terms with it. So look, there's a group, of course, I can't think of it off the top of my head.
What about Headspace?
Oh, Headspace is good.
Vertican?
Yeah.
I think they do a lot of work in this area as well. Yeah,
they do. There are those good organisations, but the simplest thing, particularly with kids where you do have control, even if they're difficult up to the age of 18, you do have control as a parent. The GP is always an easy place to start, particularly if it's a long-term family GP they've known for a long time. The kids have been going there for coughs and colds and the like for a long time. So there's also Kids Helpline, which is was started by Lifeline and spun off many, many years ago. So there are organisations out there, but we've through our friends have experienced now more and more situations where teachers and school principals and the like just get it straight away. There's no argument, there's no pushback. It's not, well, they're just having a lend. There will always be kids who do that, right? It's no longer they're having a lend. It's a case of, well, they've been to see the local psychologist, psychiatrist, counsellor, GP, and they do have some issues.
This is a very specific question from Jill. She's been running fitness and wellness classes for teenage girls who are suicidal, and sadly, a few as young as 12 years old. This was funded for a short time, but no more funding is available. Is there an option for funding to continue through any other system? Perhaps I might actually put Jill in touch with the council too. There might be some grant there. Do you know of anything, John, where funding's available to support these sorts of groups?
Well, we're lucky because we're a behemoth. Lifeline takes more calls than all the other, Beyond Blue. Everybody else combined, we take more calls than them annually in Australia. So, and we've been around for a long time. So there's that's one of the benefits. Mind you, we could always do with another $5 or $10 million tomorrow. I wonder if things like GoFundMe, those sorts of pages would be helpful. Now, you have to probably need those young girls, young women to tell their story to attract people in. Candy gets this, to attract people in. But I think that would be one area of funding. And then I think council as well. It's hard to have small groups doing great work to get into the big system of funding. It really is. But what I'm thrilled to hear about what you're doing is recognising the link between mental health and physical health. And, you need to keep moving. You need to keep physically exercising. It's an important part of managing your mental health. It's probably a great way of bringing girls together as well. And in that, I'm sure what you're doing is not just exercising their bodies, but you're taking very clever and subtle opportunities to exercise their minds as well. Maybe schools would kick in. I wonder if some of the local girls' schools or high schools might kick in a little bit of money. It sounds like you don't need a fortune. And the other thing too is that a lot of those venues, particularly if it's school kids, will give you, what you want to get venues for free. Maybe council helps there. I don't know, Candy. But
yes, that's a possibility.
But yeah.
Okay, just talking about fitness and mental fitness. So Beverly, she actually produces a podcast for Lifeline, Holding On to Hope. And she's been doing a lot of interviews with survivors of suicide. One of the things that she's noticed is that a number of them say that they've had suicidal thoughts since they were children, as young as 10. And John, I think you said that in your video as well.
Yes.
She's posing the question, could mental fitness classes take the same priority as physical fitness classes in school? And if so, how do you think that could happen?
That's a fantastic question, because a bit like poverty, a bit like many physical illnesses, a bit like social constraints, I'm looking for a better word. For many people, it's all done and dusted by the time you're 5 or 10, trying to change somebody's, if you've grown up in a world where nobody works, everyone's on welfare, housing commission, the old phrase and the like, breaking out of that cycle of poverty and unemployment is really bloody hard, and it gets harder the longer you don't have the opportunity to break out of that cycle. The same for mental health. Bill Cruz, many of you may know Bill Cruz, who runs the Exodus Foundation. I grew up over in Balmain and Haverfield, and I was on the board of the Exodus Foundation when I was 18 or something. I'm not sure I was fully aware of my company director duties at the time. Anyway, it was great. Bill was literally going to King's Cross and dragging kids off the streets and bringing them back to Ashfield and giving them a hot meal and trying to sort them out. And I had him speak to a group of people, nearly 30 years ago, I guess. And we said, Bill, what do you do? How do you break the cycle? And Bill said, and this is before the stolen generation, Bill said, every kid at the age of 10 there should be a complete review of the family they're in, and if it doesn't work, pull them out. And that's a man who does this for a living, just looking at this, saying, how do you break the cycle? So if you can get to kids younger, and if you can talk about mental health and about self-reflection, about stillness and a whole lot of other things, there's no doubt you can make a difference. I probably don't think it's a long way away that we might begin to see that, because the links are, the science and the facts are blatantly clear. So that's an interesting one. I might take that away, Beverly, and think about talking it up myself, because I think it would make a difference. And when you've got parents with 10-year-old kids taking their own life and 10-year-old kids seeing psychiatrists, and the only problem I have, but we're already there, right, is every problem we have, we say, oh, why don't they learn that at school? Oh, why don't they get taught that at school? And teachers, I feel sorry for teachers. What we're really saying is there is one thing everybody has to do from the age of 5 to the age of, 15, maybe 18, and that is they've got to go to school. And they've got to do it for 40 weeks of the year. So do we use that place? Because if there's a bad parental influence, how do we cut through? So but we do look up their physical health. I'd also venture a guess there are lots of schools doing more on mental health as well.
Yes, well, I know there's a lot more counsellors in schools and things like
there
that.
Are.
So that's helpful.
Yeah. But it's the positive mental health message we need. Yeah.
Probably time for one, and this is a very specific one. And short answer, please, John. Regarding treatments for depression, do you have any views on ketamine? Is that how you pronounce it? Ketamine infusions for those suffering severe depression?
No, I don't have any views on that. I don't know enough about it.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I think we might wrap. Wow, what a wonderful, wonderful session this has been. John, thank you so much. I think a couple of the key things that have come out of this really is, and when I did some training on this, I was stunned when they said to me, you actually asked the person personally, as you said, are you feeling suicidal? Yeah. I never in a fit would have thought that was the right thing to do. And
exactly.
The more we get that message out there, the better. And the other thing that really stood out for me was never walk past somebody. So, as you said, if somebody's having a heart attack or something, you would never walk past them. And so we need to be mindful of the same with people with mental health. And basically ring 000. I mean, the resources are there, but stay near you said to grab them. I don't know that everybody would want to grab them, but certainly if somebody's in distress, ring 000 and get help, because I think you wouldn't walk past somebody with a heart attack.
And if I can just jump in briefly, people think Lifeline's only for people who are distressed or suicidal. You asked me a question about how can you help. If you're worried about somebody, ring Lifeline and get some advice. So we exist also to say, you might say, look, I've got brother, sister, whatever, here's what's happening. And the Lifeline folks can give you some advice. So it's not just about people who themselves are suicidal or in distress. It's about how we might help those people as well. So please use Lifeline 13, 11, 14, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Okay, well, that brings us to the final slide. Here we are. So one of the things that we've endeavoured to do, John, is to raise some money for Lifeline through this seminar series. And I know that quite a bit of money actually has already been donated. And those who haven't had a chance to do that, who would like to, here on the screen is the Lifeline donation line. And gosh, I mean, as you said, the calls just keep growing and growing. And we're so proud of Lifeline Northern Beaches. Boy, do they do an amazing
brilliant
job. Absolutely brilliant. So I think it's time for us to wrap up. I really want to thank you, John. You've been absolutely awesome. You always deliver, and the work that you and Lucy do is just extraordinary. So thank you from our
Very
community
nice of you to say. Thank
and
you.
also from Australia for the work that you do. It makes a huge difference. I also want to thank my Good for Manly team. We've never done this before, and we've all been terribly nervous. And I think we've done a very professional production. So we will be sending those who are online a quick survey. Probably get it tomorrow. If you wouldn't mind filling that in, that would be fantastic. So I think that's it. Any final word, John, before we say goodbye to everybody?
No, look, thank you. Thanks for everybody's interest in the little things they obviously do in their own lives to help people. And as I say, 13, 11, 14, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Great. All righty. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, John. And hopefully we'll see you around the street soon.
Excellent. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.